Judges chapter 18. Judges 18 is the story of the tribe of Dan that's looking for a new place to live. And despite the appearance of this story in the final chapters, it appears in the final chapters of the book of Judges, this event actually took place just a few decades after Joshua's death, at around the time of the very first judge of Israel, Othniel. Now, to help explain that the era of the judges was one of extreme spiritual darkness for Israel, the culprit being a return to the old ways of their Egyptian style of religion that got mixed with the Canaanite mystery Babylon superstitions of their neighbors. We find this rather detailed narrative about a fellow named Micah, who lives in the northern hills of the territory of Ephraim. Now, Micah was a well-to-do Hebrew. Probably we would classify him as rich. And this is reflected in the previous chapter where Micah's story begins, and he has just admitted to stealing 1,100 pieces of silver from his own mother. A very sizable sum of money, by the way. Now, 200 pieces of that silver was used to cast an image of Jehovah, where it would be placed in Micah's private home sanctuary, along with some other gods and idols. And Micah even went so far as to hire and then consecrate upon his own authority an itinerant Levite as his family priest. So we see how confused and mixed up Israel's religion had become in only a generation after Joshua's outstanding leadership of Israel ended in his death. Things happen fast. Now, hopefully we can take it to heart that it's easy, if not natural and inevitable, that men will gravitate away from God's truth and towards one more to their liking. The result being a set or many sets of traditions and customs and doctrines that sound quite pious and good and peaceful and right. But in fact, many of these doctrines are not actually in line with the Word of God. Probably Judeo-Christianity can be held up as the prime example in all history of this kind of syncretism that mixes cultures with agendas, with personal preferences, and a general comfort level with divine oracle. So we need not be so surprised at what we read here if we'll just take an honest assessment of where Judaism and where the church stands today, and then go compare it to the Bible itself. And of course, Micah, his young priest, and the men of the tribe of Dan who come to visit them don't see any wrong-mindedness in their thinking. They see no wickedness in their actions. They see no perversion in their worship of God. Yet this entire story is about faith gone astray, and then people who just deny it. Now, as we ended our last lesson, the scouts from Dan were returning to Micah's house after what, in their eyes, had been a wonderfully successful journey. They had stumbled across the perfect place for their tribe to relocate. The place was called Laish and was located near the border of Lebanon. The city was inhabited by gentle, loving people who had no apparent alliances with any formidable kings or princes. The area was fertile. It had an abundance of water. The city's defenses were nearly non-existent. And so the Danites could conquer the city pretty easily. So after scouts went back to the Danite cities of Zorah and Eshtaol and reported their find to the elders and to the tribal leaders, 600 soldiers of Dan and their families packed up, and they headed north to claim their prize from this unsuspecting people of Laish. So this column of around 3,000 Danites followed a trail that led nearby to Micah's house, where the 5 scouts decided to steal Micah's Jehovah idol and take his priest with them to become their own priest. Micah's priest was not kidnapped. He was offered a bigger job with more prestige, and he'd be priest over an entire city and perhaps an entire tribe, whereby currently he was only priest for a single family. It was just too tempting of an offer not to accept. So let's pick up with Judges 18, verse 22. Judges 18, verse 22. If you have a complete Jewish Bible, it is page 292. 292. When they were a good distance from Micah's house, the men who lived in the houses near his got together with him, overtook the people from Dan, and began shouting at them. And the people from Dan turned and said to Micah, "What's wrong with you? You've gathered such a crowd." And he answered, "You've taken away my God, which I made. You've gone off with my priest. What more have I got? How can you ask me what's wrong with you?" Well, the men of Dan replied, "You had best say no more to us, because some of us might get angry and attack you. You could lose your life, and so might the others in your household." Then the people from Dan went their way, and when Micah saw they were just too strong for him, he turned and went back to his house. So they took what Micah had made and his priest. They came to Laish, to a quiet, trusting people. They attacked, killed them, burned down their city. No one came to rescue them because it was far from Sidon. They had no dealings with other peoples. This was in the valley near Beit Rehov. Then the people of Dan rebuilt the city, and they settled there. And they named the city Dan, after Dan, their ancestor, who was born to Israel. Now, although the city had previously been called Laish, and the people of Dan set up the image for themselves. Jehonatan, Jonathan, the son of Gershom, the son of Manasseh, and his sons were priests for the tribe of the people of Dan until the day of the exile from the land. Thus they erected for themselves Micah's idol, which he had made, and it remained there as long as the house of God was in Shiloh. Verse 27 explains, well, let's back up. Micah and the people who lived in his village were pretty upset with those soldiers from Dan who took their idols and took their priest. So they followed them for a while, and then they confronted them. And since Dan had 600 men who were ready to fight, and apparently with the will to do so, they threatened Micah and his posse with death if they didn't shut up about wanting their idols and ritual implements back. Knowing they couldn't win a battle against Dan, Micah and his contingent returned home empty-handed. Well, verse 27 explains that Dan did what they came to do. When they reached Laish, they attacked. They killed the people, they burned the city, and sure enough, no one came to the aid of the poor citizens of Laish. And as was customary, Laish got renamed. It got renamed to Dan. And they set up the silver image they had stolen from Micah. They began their cult worship with the young Levite presiding over the whole thing. Now, I told you last week that this Levite was not a real God-authorized priest because he was not from the proper priestly line of the tribe of Levi. And I told you I'd reveal this week how I knew that. Well, here's how we found out. Verse 30 explains that this Levite's name is Jehonatan, Jonathan, and he's of the clan of Gershom. The problem is that Gershom was a clan of regular Levites, but only those from the clan of Aaron could be priests. But there's also a confusing reference here to Manasseh that's contained within the Levites' identity, because Manasseh isn't in any way connected with the tribe of Levi, so what gives? Well, let's look at this briefly because it gives a very interesting insight into the minds of those who penned the Bible that we read today. The issue is a translation error that is somewhat intentional. The consonants that form the name of Jonathan's family line, as spelled in the oldest texts that are available, that are translated in many Bibles as Manasseh, like here in our Complete Jewish Bible, are MSH, or in the Hebrew alphabet, Mem, Shin, He. These are the same consonants that also form the name of Moses. Now remember, the original Hebrew script only uses consonants, no vowels. However, what we actually find is that a tiny N, a nun, was written above and between the mem and the shin, between the M and the S, in some of the ancient Hebrew texts that make the name properly Manasseh. Point being that the nun did not belong there. It was added at some later date by an unknown editor who didn't want to corrupt the text, but in a strange way of thinking, by making the letter nun tiny and placed above the other letters, it allowed the reader's choice of pronouncing those letters either Moses or Manasseh. Why would he do that? Well, if left alone, it says that Jonathan was of the clan of Gershon, son of Moses. By adding the nun, it says that it was Jonathan was of the clan of Gershon, but Gershon was a son of Manasseh. The Talmud explains this anomaly and the reason behind it. Was he, Jonathan, the son of Gershom, or was he not rather a descendant of Moses? As it is written, the sons of Moses were Gershon and Eleazar. But because of the wicked deeds of Manasseh, the idolatrous son of Hezekiah, the scriptures assign Gershom to the family of Manasseh. Rabbi Bar Chana said, the prophets studiously avoided calling Gershon the son of Moses because it would have been ignominious to Moses to have an ungodly son, Jonathan. So he, who is later editor of Judges, calls this person the son of Manasseh by raising the nun above the line to show that it might be inserted or omitted. Bottom line, whoever edited the oldest Hebrew scriptures we have felt it disrespectful to Moses to link this Levite who was disguising himself as a priest. So since Manasseh was known to be an idolatrous clan, it was better to assign this fake priest to Manasseh's family instead of sullying Moses' reputation. Interestingly, the Greek Septuagint, which was written about 250 years before Christ, did not offer this option. And they more accurately say that Jonathan was indeed a descendant of Moses, which he was. This is not the only place that this kind of thing happens in the Bible. Okay, and sometimes I'll point it out to you when it's appropriate. Okay, let's move on. This chapter ends with a very interesting reference to Micah's idol being used by the tribe of Dan, and then it says, as long as the house of God was in Shiloh. Shiloh was where the wilderness tabernacle, called generically the house of God, was erected, and it semi-permanently was located when Israel first entered the Promised Land. It was there where the official priesthood operated. It would later be transferred to Beit El, and we'll even find the Ark of the Covenant getting moved around quite a bit more than the sacred tent itself. Point being that almost immediately after Joshua wasn't around to run things with an iron rod, every element of Hebrew society began backsliding at an alarming rate. So the resounding and repeated underlying premise for the entire book of Judges is there was no king in Israel. So every man did what was right in his own eyes. This is why I say to you, the whole book of Judges is about Israel needed a king. Turn your Bibles to Judges chapter 19. That's page 293 if you have a complete Jewish Bible. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, there was a certain Levite, living on the far side of the Ephraim hills, who took a woman from Bethlehem in Judah to be his concubine. But his concubine was unfaithful to him and left him to go to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, where she stayed for some time, 4 months. Then her husband went after her to persuade her to return. He had his servant with him and a pair of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he was glad to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, kept him there. So he remained with him for 3 days, and they ate and they drank and they stayed there. Well, on the 4th day, they got up early in the morning, and he prepared to leave. But the girl's father said to the son-in-law, "You'll feel better if you have a bite of food before you leave." So the two of them sat down and ate and drank together. And then the girl's father said to the man, "Please stay one night more. Have a good time." And the man rose to leave, but his father-in-law pressed him. So he stayed there again. On the morning of the 5th day, he got up to leave. But the girl's father said, "Why did you have something to eat? Leave this afternoon." So the two men ate. And when the man got up to leave with his concubine and servant, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Look, it's almost evening. Please just stay the night. You see it's getting late. Stay on, enjoy yourself. Tomorrow get going early on your way home." But the man wouldn't stay that night. So he got up and he left his concubine and his 2 saddled donkeys, and they arrived and left with his concubine and his 2 saddled donkeys, and they arrived at Jebus, all right, also known as Jerusalem. And by the time they arrived at Jebus in early evening, and the servant said to his master, "Why don't we go into this city of the Jebusi, the Jebusites, and stay there?" But his master said to him, "We won't go into a city of foreigners which doesn't belong to the people of Israel. We'll go on across to Gibeah." And he said to his servant, "Let's go, and we'll get to one of those places. We'll stay in Gibeah or Ramah." So they went on. They kept traveling until the sun set on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. There they turned off the road to go and stay in Gibeah. He went in and sat down in the city's open space, since no one had offered his home for them to spend the night. In time, at nightfall, an old man came from his work in the field, and he was from the Ephraim hills. He was staying in Gibeah, although the residents were of Benjamin. The old man looked up, and he saw the traveler in the city's open space, and he said, "Where are you going? Where are you coming from?" And he replied, "We're crossing from Bethlehem in Yehuda to the far side of the Ephraim hills. That's where I'm from. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and now I'm going to the house of Adonai. But there's no one here who will let me spend the night in his home." "Well, we have straw and food for our donkeys, also bread and wine for me, my concubine, and the boy there with your servants. We don't need anything else." And the old man said, "Well, you're welcome to stay with me. I'll take care of anything you lack. Just don't spend the night out in the open." So he brought him home and gave food to the donkeys, and they washed their feet, they ate, they drank. They were relaxing when suddenly some men from the city, good for nothing, surrounded the house and began beating at the door. "Send out the man who came home with you," they demanded of the old man whose house it was. "We want to have sex with him." And the man whose house it was went out and said to them, "No, my brothers, please don't do anything as wrong as this. Look, he's just a guest in my house. Don't do this degrading thing. Here's my daughter, who's a virgin, and his concubine. I'll bring them out. Mistreat them. Do what you want to them, but don't do such a degrading thing to this man." However, the men wouldn't listen to him. So the man took hold of his concubine and brought her out to them. They raped her and abused her all night. Only at dawn did they let her go. At daybreak, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her husband was, and she was still there when it grew light. When her husband got up, opened the doors of the house, and went out to go on his way, he saw the woman lying there with her hands stretched out towards the door. He said to her, "Get up, let's go." But there was no answer. So he loaded her body onto the donkey and began his trip home. And on arrival at his house, he got a knife, took hold of his concubine's body, and cut her up into 12 pieces, and sent them to all the regions of Israel. Everyone who saw it said, "From the day the people of Israel came up from Egypt until now, never has such a thing happened or even been seen. What are we going to do about it? Talk it over and decide." Quite a story. Now, this story probably took place even earlier than the story of Micah, the silver image of God, and the Levite who masqueraded as a priest. It represents one of the most infamous outrages against the Lord that is recorded in Holy Scripture. One that authors of biblical writings of much later eras referred to. That's how well known and repeated this sad episode was. Well, the theme of the book of Judges begins the story. There was no king in Israel, and there was no law and order because there was no central authority. And although this sojourning Levite who lived in the hills of Ephraim sounds an awful lot like our previous story, it's not the same fellow. But it does illustrate that Micah's Levite hireling was not an isolated instance at all. It had become quite common for Levites to seek position and advancement wherever they could find it. The setup is that this anonymous Levite living in the more northern area of Ephraim had taken on a concubine. And her family home was in Beit Lechem in Judah, meaning that she was not a Levite, she was a Judahite. But at some point, there was this serious problem, and the woman left him, and she went back to her father. Well, when we hear what happened, kind of get the idea what the serious problem may have been. Guy was kind of a jerk. Verse 2 explains the nature of the problem. Or does it? The complete Jewish Bible, along with the King James Version and many others, says that the concubine was unfaithful to her Levite husband, or some say outright that she played the harlot or acted like a whore. Now, in the Hebrew, the latter translation is absolutely the correct one because the Hebrew word that was used to describe her she was a zonah, meaning a prostitute, or in some manuscripts, she behaved like a zana, which means she acted in an unfaithful manner. However, other translations will say she was angry with her husband and left him. And those are equally good translations because they are drawn from ancient Aramaic texts, also from the Greek Septuagint, which speak of anger, not unfaithfulness. The general consensus of rabbis is that the Levite and his concubine had an argument of some kind, and she had not been unfaithful to him, at least not sexually speaking. And the reason is that by both the Mosaic law and the customs and traditions of that era, a concubine or a wife who had an adulterous affair was just to be summarily executed. And there's no hint in this story that she was in any danger of being harmed Now, by her husband. Now, I want to remind you that a concubine, a pelegesh in Hebrew, was like a second-class wife. So it was common for the Bible to refer to the man as a concubine's husband, just a way of speaking. Simplistically speaking, the difference between a concubine and a wife was that the wife had more rights, including the fact that she had a marriage contract. But the concubines weren't slaves. They couldn't be mistreated any more than a legal wife. They were not acquired as playful sex objects or mistresses, as sometimes has been erroneously depicted. And we see in verse 3 that her husband was concerned enough for her that after 4 months' time, even though it was only a selfish concern that he preferred her company, that he took the rather substantial journey from the northern hill country down to Bethlehem in Judah to try and win her back. And he brought a house servant with him, undoubtedly for protection, as traveling alone in those days was pretty dangerous, and he brought 2 donkeys. Now, one was for her to ride on for the return journey, hopefully, and undoubtedly several gifts for the concubine and her father were brought along as well. And the fact that she brought her husband into her father's house shows that whatever caused the split up was not irreconcilable. It also says her father was glad to meet him. Translation: father was very relieved that his daughter would be going back with her husband. Now, I say that not in the sense that it probably sounds to us today, as though he was really glad to get rid of this girl, but rather in the sense that it was very dishonorable for a family to have a girl get married or become a concubine and then become separated from her husband. If, God forbid, that separation grew to an outright divorce, it brought great shame upon the whole family, regardless of the reason or who might be to blame. So Dad had been sweating it out. So on the 4th day after his arrival, the Levite man was ready to leave, but the father-in-law wants him to stay a little longer. Now, likely this was a simple matter of Middle Eastern hospitality. Visitors were rare, and a protocol required making the most of your time together. The father-in-law pressed the Levite to stay, and he agreed to, but on the 5th day, he took his concubine and left in the afternoon. Now the Levite, his concubine, and his servant set out for home. And their route took them to Jebus. This was the name of the city that would eventually become renamed to Jerusalem. Jebus was around 6 miles from Bethlehem. That's maybe a 2-hour walk at most. The people who founded and controlled the city were called Jebusites, and they were just another group of Canaanites. And since it was getting near to sundown, the servant suggested that they spend the night inside these massive defensive walls of Jebus, but the Levite refused, because they were a city of Gentiles. They were a city of non-Israelites. Instead, he preferred that they travel a little bit further and then stay in a village or a city that was occupied by Hebrews. And the 2 nearest ones the way they were headed was either Gibeah or Ramah. They made it only as far as Gibeah by the time darkness set in, so they stopped. Gibeah was in the territory of Benjamin, so its residents were Israelites. Now, verse 15 explains, they went inside the city. They sat down at what we would call the city square, which is just inside the city gates, and such a thing would make him pretty noticeable to the city's residents as they passed in and out. Now, there's no hint of what was to come, though, in that the reason he sat in the square, we're told, is that no one would offer them hospitality. No one would give them a place to stay for the night. This was a sacred duty in that era, and the failure of the local residents to offer rest and sustenance to a traveler, especially one who obviously had the means to feed himself and his animals if it need be, was a sign that these people who lived there the Jebusites, were of a poor character. At dark, an old man came through the city gates, a man who had been working out in the fields that surrounded the walled city of Gibeah. And coincidentally, this old man was not from the same area that the Levite hailed, and was a permanent resident of Gibeah, nor was he of the tribe of Benjamin. That the old man did not share in the morals of Gibeah, or immorality of Gibeah, probably better, is evident in that he does the right thing. This old man offers to take the Levite and his concubine and his servant into his own dwelling place for the night. Now, of course, the old man first inquires after them and asks the logical question, where are you going to? Where are you from? The Levite's truthful. He explains where he's from and that he's returning there, but the latter part of the answer is puzzling. He says he's going to the house of Adonai, or more accurately, the Beit Yehovah. But what does that mean, he's going to the house of Yehovah? Almost certainly he was merely saying that he was going to go home by way of Shiloh, which was the current location of the wilderness tabernacle. He was a Levite, so it would be logical that if he had an opportunity to visit the tabernacle, the home of the priesthood, he'd go there to offer a sacrifice. But there's another implication in this scene that some Jewish scholars point out. This Levite traveler was probably recognizable as a Levite. Levites had, for some reason, quickly developed a dialect or an accent, because we saw that play a role in our previous story. And it was different enough from the other Hebrews that it helped to identify him. He may also have worn garments, some ritual object of clothing that marked him as a Levite. In any case, the reason the town of Gibeah wouldn't offer him hospitality was they did not want to do anything to do with the priestly tribe of Levi. They may have been Israelites, but their hearts were far from God. And the Levite explains to the old man that even though they would be no burden on anyone because they carried all of their own provisions with them, the townspeople still refused to offer them shelter. So the old man says, come and stay with him. But whatever they do, don't stay out in that city square at nighttime. Now, this matter of avoiding bedding down in the city square, which would have been lawful and safe under most circumstances, had very little to do with discomfort. Rather, it was a dire warning from someone who knew these townspeople very well. Well, the next scene is reminiscent of the sad adventure of Lot when he was living in the city of Sodom. The old man was playing host to his guests when suddenly there was a knock on the door. In fact, his house was surrounded, we're told, by some worthless men of Gibeah who were demanding that he send out the Levite so they could have homosexual sex with him. In Hebrew, these worthless men are called Ben Belial, or sons of Belial, which is a very derogatory expression. It is used in many places in the Bible. It's used to label those who commit idolatry or gross rebellion against God, or who commit lewd and immoral acts. And it says that the sons of Belial dafach upon the old man's door. This definitely does not mean to knock. Nor does it mean even to merely beat. It means to beat violently with ever-increasing force. This was a mob. They were going to knock that door down if they had to. They meant business. They were not going to take no for an answer. The old man had to address this situation. He just couldn't huddle inside and hope these perverts went away. So he opens his door to address them. Now, before I discuss with you what he offered to the crowd in hopes of appeasing them, I want to first explain why he offered it. I've explained many times the Oriental mindset concerning hospitality, and I will tell you, you will still encounter it today in the Middle East and in Israel. Among the several things that hospitality entailed, especially in that era, protection of the house guest was paramount. There was no greater shame than for a host to allow something terrible to befall a guest in his home. Hosts were obligated by custom to defend their guests with the cost of their own lives or their families' lives if necessary. And just as families today have set up an unspoken hierarchy whereby the children are protected at all costs by adult family members, and even the younger children are protected almost out of instinct by the older children, it was the same sort of thing with families that took in travelers whom they'd never before met. So the old man offers to send out his own unmarried daughter, called a virgin, as well as the Levite's concubine for them to gang rape and trade for keeping the males safe. Now, in ancient times, and still in many Eastern societies today, including the more fundamental sects of Islam, women are simply chattel. Women have far less value than men, very often, including today, much less value than farm animals. Okay. The laws of Moses were really the first to value women equally with men and to insist on the humane treatment of women and to give women far more rights than they had ever known before. Now, don't get me wrong, the Bible still presents a hierarchy whereby men are to be the authority, but men are to be an authority over women in love and for the purpose of caring for women, not for the purpose of using them or virtually enslaving them. However, worldwide customs and traditions infiltrate everything. And the Hebrew society remained a male-dominated society. What we see happening in regard to the women in this story is not acceptable before the Lord. I want to also point out what makes this story so extraordinarily shocking. Certainly that homosexuality is at its center is undeniable and is at the top of the list of godless perversions throughout the Bible, Old Testament and New. But what we must also see is that while we've witnessed this all before in the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, at least the residents of those cities were pagans. They didn't know God. But the men of Gibeah, who are demanding homosexual sex with this old man's male guests here in the book of Judges, are Hebrews. They're of the tribe of Benjamin. They had the Torah. Their parents, probably grandparents, were part of the Exodus from Egypt. Joshua had just recently died. This mob consisted of God's set-apart people who were no more than one generation removed from Moses. One. The old man handed over his daughter and the Levite's concubine to the men of Gibeah, no doubt by the way, with the Levite's consent, who chose to sacrifice this woman to save himself. They were abused all night long. It only ceased at daybreak. Nothing more is said of the old man's daughter, but we're informed that the concubine somehow made it back to the doorstep of where her husband was hiding, and there she died of her injuries with her hands reaching out towards the bolted door. Daybreak, the Levite went outside to leave, and there he found his woman. He looks down at her and says, "Get up. We need to get going now." But of course, there was no response. He immediately knew she was dead, so he loaded her corpse on one of the two donkeys and left her home. Now, it's not only the horrific action of the men at Gibeah that are on display here, but this callous, cold heart of this Levite who is utterly indifferent to his concubine's suffering. And I said at the beginning of this story that I suspect that the entire reason for the Levite going after his concubine after she angrily left him and went home to be with her father was selfish. He preferred to have her company than not, but that's about as far as it went. Perhaps he thought her leaving him would be an embarrassment and cause him dishonor. That he went to Bethlehem to fetch her back with gifts and a donkey for her to ride home was simply the price needed for him to get her back. A price he could afford with little discomfort. But that price certainly didn't include any risk-taking. It didn't include any repentance on his part, nor did it mean that he would love her and protect her. Now, this sin of Gibeah, what they did that night, would be long remembered. It would be mentioned centuries later in the book of Hosea 9:9 and 10:9. So great was the shame that it brought upon all Israel. In Hosea 9:9, they have deeply corrupted themselves as in the days of Gibeah. He, meaning God, will remember their guilt, and he will punish their sins. Hosea 10:9. Since the days of Gibeah you have sinned, Israel. There they took their stand. For these arrogant people at Gibeah, war was insufficient punishment. But when the Levite arrived back home, he did something so drastic that it is hard to even read about it without cringing. He took his concubine's body and cut her up into 12 pieces, dismembered her, sending one piece by messenger to each Israelite tribe. I don't even know where to begin to talk about this. This Levite obviously had no regard for his concubine before or after her death. That he would cut up her body is a terrible desecration that is simply not allowed by Torah standards. She was to be properly buried, not used as a means for this Levite to display his anger, but the Hebrew word used for cutting up, or better, dividing her body into pieces is a word that is normally reserved for tabernacle ritual. The word is nathak. And nathak means to divide up the animal sacrifice into pieces for putting onto the altar of burnt offering. That it is used here is out of place. And so it seems to indicate that the Levite had some delusional sense of piety or righteous anger or twisted belief that if he was the one doing the cutting up, because he was a Levite, that it made it a proper religious act. Taken together with the other young Levite of our previous story who allowed himself to become a priest when he was not of the proper lineage to do it, even to worship teraphim, god idols, then that he would leave Micah to go be a priest for the tribe of Dan and then be in charge of setting up cult worship in Laish paints a pretty bad picture of the Hebrew religious leadership of the era of the judges. See, the Levites were the butchers of that era, essentially. They cut up animals and meat all the time. They were highly trained in just how to dissect an animal for sacrificial purposes, and then later on how to prepare an animal for food according to kosher traditions that slowly developed. Even today, it might surprise you to know it's usually Levites who run kosher butcher shops. This Levite man simply applied his skill to his dead concubine for personal reasons. Now, things like this do not go unnoticed. Verse 30 explains that when the people saw this, they were appalled, as they had never seen such an awful thing happen, at least in within their own culture. So the question on everyone's mind was what to do about all this. What should be done about these homosexual men in Gibeah who literally raped this concubine to death? But also, what should be done about the tribe of Benjamin in general, who apparently didn't show enough interest in the matter to bring these men to justice? That's what's dealt with in the final 2 chapters of the book of Judges. And we will do that next time.